Welcome. We're very appreciative that you're here this evening, and this is a great turnout, and it's also a turnout even after most of the students have left. We don't have our normal component of students, so thank you all very much for coming. And I want to do one shout out that's student related, because one of the Council on World Affairs board members, Kevin Goldberg, was named Teacher of the Year at Savannah Country Day. So can we get a... There he is. He's hiding there in the back. So congratulations, Kevin. Great job. I'm a huge admirer of. I can't think of a more important profession than teaching. We are very, very fortunate, ladies and gentlemen, to have with us Ambassador Kurt Volker. You may have read his bio about his career in government, originally at the CIA, then in the Foreign Service, as your ambassador to NATO, but he was actually maybe even unusually qualified for that, because he had worked for one of the previous Secretary Generals of NATO, George Robertson. Some of you might remember Secretary General Robertson. So he was already very well prepared when he took the NATO job, and then as our special representative for the Ukraine negotiations. For most recently, but there's also a couple of other things. He's really covered the world in terms of an academic background, in terms of supporting education, and something you might not read is he's one of the founders of. You've heard me say this before. I'm a huge proponent of the U.S. educational system as a place to which I would love to have more foreigners come to be exposed to the United States. And Kurt is one of the founders of something called the American University of Kyiv in Ukraine. And it's very, very hard to start a university, and 350 students now? So far. Yeah. So that's really great. And he has a long-standing connection to the McCain Institute and Arizona State University, and he's on several boards, and he does consulting. And I know that, I think we said to you, one of the issues that you wanted to hear about, besides Russia and China and all that, was NATO. And Kurt will hopefully be able to preview an event that will take place here in July in Washington, July 9th to 11th, which is the NATO Summit, which is extremely important. And Kurt can offer his views of that. But you know that his subject is a new storm is gathering. Can we prevent the next war? And I hope you read carefully, that announcement that we sent out, because this is all about the challenges that the United States faced in arguably the most complex environment, I think, foreign policy environment that this country has ever faced, apart from obviously a world war in which we're sending off our soldiers. He will hopefully maybe give us some thoughts on what the NATO should be doing, as well as what it is and what the analysis of what it might do, and the kind of threat that is presented by someone like President Putin and his leadership of Russia, but then the confluence of challenges from China, and then from others who, I think, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell called it not that long ago, the coalition of the aggrieved. Russia, China, everybody that doesn't like the kind of system that has been created over the many decades. So we're really in for a treat, and thank you very, very much for coming. I want to thank again our main sponsor, particularly for tonight, Kreitz, and what Kreitz does in the community at large. You know what the company does as the distributor for Buick and GMC and BMW, Mercedes and Sprinter vans. But they've been a great kind of corporate citizen here in Savannah, and we're deeply appreciative of the support that they've given us over the years. So please. This is the last program of the until we get to the summer. We take our summer break for June, July, and August. But to give you a preview, we've mentioned it before, on September 19th, you'll be hearing from a person with extensive government record, but now the vice president of the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Kori Schake. I used to work with her when she was at the National Security Council. And she'll be here on September 19th, and then on October 17th, another subject that you wanted to hear more about, China, both what's going on in China and the U.S.-China relationship, competition, whatever you want to call it. So we'll have Dr. Patricia Kim from Brookings. So we're pleased to have that. We have lots of other subjects looking down the road. We have an agreement to hear from people like Ambassador Tom Shannon, who used to be the number 3 at the State Department, former ambassador to Brazil and a longtime expert on Latin America, because we did have the program on Argentina last month, but apart from that, we really haven't dealt with Latin America. Can I, by the way, take a show of hands? Did any of you see the Savannah Morning News article on Ambassador Volker's presentation? That's great. That's great. Ambassador Volker was nice enough to take some time to do an interview with Savannah Morning News that you read. We also, earlier today, taped an interview, I'm not sure about the airing schedule, with WSAV. Maybe WTOC will get here this evening to cover it, but our main goal is to help inform you and in a way to make it so you don't have to just read articles, what Ambassador Volker has written, what the Savannah Morning News reports, but you get to ask your questions directly, and that's what we're trying to put you together with recognized experts and people out there giving suggestions for what U.S. policy should be and analysis of how things are going. I do want to mention that you heard us mention it before, but we will be moving venues in November, September, and October here in Skidaway, in this building. But starting with our November activity, we will be at the Coastal Georgia Center Auditorium. It's a great facility in terms of comfort and room, a great parking situation. I think it's pretty easy to get to with security, and we're looking at maybe trying to get some rideshare for those of you who might be interested, or carpooling. We'll be giving you more details, but we're excited, and we think it'll be an excellent venue, and we hope that we'll see all of you from here, there, and also that it will maybe open up new audience as well. So there's I don't want to spend any more time with all of Kurt's very lengthy bio, but he is a true expert, a true dedicated professional, meaning dedicated to the United States having the most effective U.S. foreign policy that it can. That's why people like him do what they do in terms of writing. You can see him in many videos and interview programs giving speeches at World Affairs Councils like this, because they're dedicated to the most effective U.S. foreign policy, which means the most effective promotion of U.S. National security. So without any further ado, let me introduce my friend and former colleague, Ambassador Kurt Volker.
That switch, the microphone will go on. Is that correct? No, not yet. Let's see. It has the appearances of being on. There you go. Just needs a little warm up, that's all. Well, thank you, Larry, for a very nice introduction. I hope...
We're going to make it a little bit louder.
Okay.
And then... I know you're not that cool.
Well, I'll just say insignificant little trivialities until we sort this out.
That's a great stand-up routine.
So first off, I just want to thank Larry and the board members of the council and all of you for showing out. Thank you for. No, it's a real treat to be here. It's something I really like to do. I spend a lot of time in Washington, and I spend a lot of time traveling, but to Europe, Middle East, and so forth. And to actually get around the U.S. is something I really like to do. So it's a real pleasure to be here. As a theme, I thought that I would frame up what I'm going to talk about tonight as we have to make a decision. Are we in 1938 or are we in 1949? And we need to think about that. So 1938 was Hitler taking over Austria. Everybody thought that he might be done until he said he wanted the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. And Neville Chamberlain famously said, well, okay, we'll do that, but then we're going to have peace in our time. That didn't work, because then he wanted all of Czechoslovakia. But then we thought, okay, maybe that's it. And then another year goes by, and then he and Stalin sign a secret deal, and they invade Poland, and Stalin takes over the Baltic states, and before you know it, we're in World War II. So that was 1938, and where that led to. 1949 was the founding of NATO, April 4th, 1949. Hank here, served at NATO we served together as colleagues. That was people getting their heads together and saying, what just happened must never happen again. We have to prevent the next war. We have to figure out how to prevent that. And the way to prevent it was to make sure that we banded all of our friends and allies together, that we said an attack on one's going to be an attack on all, so therefore no one would dare attack. And it worked. But I would remind you that in 1949 we didn't know it was going to work. There was a huge debate in this country about whether forming NATO was a good idea or a bad idea. Not that different from the debates you hear about should we help Ukraine, should we not help Ukraine. People were worried about what is this entangling us into. But the reality is that it built the Europe that we have today. It created peace, prosperity, security for several generations. So that was 1949. When you look around the world today, I think you see the most dangerous time that I've seen in my lifetime. And I think the most dangerous time that any one of us would have seen since those pre-World War II times. So that's, I think, the challenge. So what I'm going to try to do, and I'm not going to be hyper-structured here, but I want to say what's going on, what is the U.S. interest in all of this, what should our strategy be, and then what's NATO's role in this. And I think as much as Larry encouraged me to talk for 40 minutes, I just don't know if I'm capable of 40 minutes, and I'm not sure I want to do that to anybody. But we'll try to get through those things and hopefully cover some of the things that you're interested in and have a lot of time for Q&A as well. But as for what's going on right now, we have wars or the potential for war in 5 theaters around the world all at once. I can't recall this except for the World War II time. You have Russia waging an all-out war against Ukraine, already occupying parts of Georgia, parts of Moldova, parts of Ukraine. Putin very explicitly claiming his mission is to rebuild the Russian Empire and that he wants to reclaim Russian lands. And there cannot be an independent state living on Russian lands. Well, and I should add too, he recently orchestrated his so-called re-election as president of Russia. And his campaign slogan, anybody know? Russia has no borders. Exactly. Russia has. So if you're Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, all of them were fully incorporated into the Russian Empire at one point. That's a worry. We keep things going the way they are here. We should be worried about Alaska, perhaps. So we have to take Putin seriously. But that's only one conflict. We have China with tremendous ambitions to take over all of Taiwan, reincorporate Taiwan into a single China. But they also have claims on islands in South China Sea, including from Vietnam, for example. This can become a real conflict. Right now, it's just severe pressure and intimidation, but it could turn into open conflict. You have the war in the Middle East going on right now. which is Iran-driven, supporting their proxies in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Palestinian territories, who are attacking not only Israel, but attacking U.S. and Western interests, including the Houthis firing at shipping going in around the Arabian Peninsula. You have Russian mercenaries and others undermining governments in Africa. We're seeing coup after coup now, and the Chinese stepping in with cash to buy up what they want from Africa, really destabilizing what could be a growing and prosperous continent. And in our hemisphere, you have a growing axis between Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which is now having the effect of undermining governments in other countries in Latin America. You have had conflict in Central America between Venezuela and Colombia. Now Colombia has had its government flipped and is more in alignment with Venezuela. Same is happening in Bolivia. And this can get worse. So we have all 5 of these going at the same time. And I would also stress that these are not happening in isolation, that there's actual coordination among these. So, for an example, when Russia fires drones to kill Ukrainian civilians every night, these are Iranian drones that they're buying from Iran, manufacturing on a license in Russia sometimes, but they're Iranian drones. When the Russians fire artillery shells to kill Ukrainian civilians on the front line, or Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, they are North Korean artillery shells that the Russians had previously sold to North Korea, and now they're taking them back. And there are tens of millions of these. There's a big supply of these that the Russians are now taking back. And in return, Russia's providing North Korea with missile technology, and it's providing political support and cover for Iran as it fights in Syria, fights against Israel, fights against the West. China is sitting back and profiting from all this. I wouldn't say that China is on Russia's side in the war. I think they actually find the war kind of distasteful because they like the idea of claiming that you shouldn't violate sovereignty and territorial integrity because they view Taiwan as theirs. You shouldn't mess with that. But if Russia's going to disrupt a global, Western-oriented, rule of law, economic order in the world, then China's all in favor of that disruption because China wants to be the first among countries in that political order. So if Russia can distract and disrupt the West, it's good for China. If Russia needs to sell its energy because others aren't buying, China's happy to buy cheap energy. If Russia needs to buy goods because of sanctions, China's happy to sell goods. This doesn't mean China's aligned with Russia. It just means that China's taking advantage of the situation. And you can draw more and more connections, the historical connection between Moscow and Havana and Caracas and Venezuela now. These things really are linked. So I look at this, and I think we are now facing the greatest risk of a global war where these things become physically linked in military conflict than we have been in my entire lifetime. That this is now that time. So my view is, what's the U.S. interest in this? That's what's going on. What should we care? We have 2 oceans. We're relatively safe here. That has not historically been true. That every time one of these smaller conflicts grows into a bigger conflict and grows into another bigger conflict, we end up getting sucked in because our interests are directly at stake. So it is far cheaper and better for the United States to prevent war than it is to fight a war. And that, I think, has got to be our focus here. We have failed at this in the last several years. These 5 theaters of conflict were not on fire the way they are today, just 3 years ago, just 4 years ago. This is a relatively new development. And it feeds on itself. If one actor, like Russia, like Putin, perceives the West as weak and divided, then they try a little more, see what the reaction is. No reaction. Try a little more, see what the reaction is, and it gives encouragement. But then that also encourages China. So if the West is divided and weak and they're not dealing with this, then we have an opportunity here. And I think this also plays into the Ayatollahs' thinking in Iran, and I think it plays into these others. So we're facing an escalation of crises right now because of a perception that we in the West are weak and divided. So, the dichotomy I would put to you there is, you remember Ronald Reagan, was peace through strength. And I think that's what we need to strive for. I think today we are seeing chaos through weakness. And so we have to flip that around. So that's our interest, I would argue, is we don't want to get sucked into bigger wars. So we should be doing what we can to prevent them. Now, what should the U.S. strategy be for that? There are so many things we could talk about here. I'll summarize it saying values, goals, strategy, and alliances. I think that formula serves us well. We need to know that our values, freedom, democracy, market economy, rule of law, human rights, these are what make our societies great. It is what most people in the world want, but a majority do not have, but they want that. But that means those people are largely aligned with these values. And that when these values are respected in the world, we are safe. When those values are threatened in the world, we end up not being safe. So the starting point is to understand and support our own values. This then leads to some core goals. And the goals should be peace. The goals should be rule of law. The goals should be seeing the rise or the affirmation of those sorts of values in societies. The more democracies there are, the more law-abiding countries there are, the better for us. We can travel, we can do trade, we don't have people threatening us. When you have those who do not share those values, Putin, Xi, Ayatollahs, Kim Jong-un, Daniel Ortega, that is not good for us when they are in power. They do not respect those values, and they are deliberately trying to attack and threaten us. So we need to have clear goals about supporting our allies, opposing our adversaries. And now the strategy for that has got to start with building our own strength. It starts here. So economy, military, distinguishing our friends from our adversaries and supporting our friends and working with our friends and being clear about who our adversaries are. These things all build capital so that we project greater strength. I think one of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years is we had underinvested in our own defense industry. We need to be able to produce more. And I would say, fortunately, again, what's the U.S. interest in this? By helping Ukraine diminish the threat from Russia, by eliminating Russian conventional military forces, we are giving them old equipment. We are giving the Pentagon money to buy new equipment. And so we are revving up our defense industry, and we are renewing our own military capabilities, and we're learning from what the Ukrainians are doing as they use our old equipment. This is actually a good way of investing in our own defense capabilities. And then alliances. And I want to emphasize this as well because we're going to come to NATO next. One of the great advantages that the U.S. has in the world is that we are not alone. Because of our values, people want to be with us and work together. So we have 32 allies now in the NATO Treaty Alliance. That is the territory of 32 countries that is secure, that is not a threat to us, that projects security elsewhere. And these are countries that, though they are smaller than we are, they contribute as they're able. And we often look at the total volume of assistance or military support that the U.S. provides. It is the biggest, by far. But when you look at it on a per capita basis or a per GDP basis, there's a lot of countries that are doing a lot. And Poland, I would single out as one of the countries that formerly was in the Warsaw Pact. They gained their freedom. They wanted to join NATO. We admitted them to NATO. They are now spending 4% of GDP on defense. They are the core of military logistics in Central and Eastern Europe. They're a vital ally for us. And if Poland were not a NATO ally, we would be facing instability there and Russian forces pressing further west than they are now. So it's a very good thing that we enlarged NATO when we did, and that has made us have more breathing room, safer and secure, not to mention the Poles. And that's just one example. So that's the strategy. So if that's the case, what should we be doing at this NATO summit in July of this year in Washington, D.C.? It's 75th anniversary of NATO. Started with 12 countries. And as more countries became free and democratic and wanted to be safe, they petitioned to join NATO. So one of the stories that is incorrect that Vladimir Putin tells is NATO is expanding up to his borders. That's not actually what's happening. It is countries that are afraid of Russia or were previously occupied by Russia or dominated by Russia are now free, and they don't want to be dominated by Russia again. So they want to be part of an alliance where they are protected and they protect others. So we've seen that again and again and again. We now have, as I said, 32 countries in NATO. But as we get together for the 75th anniversary, we're looking at the biggest war in Europe since World War II. So this is hardly a time for celebration. Now, we can't look ourselves in the mirror and say, we're doing great, because we're not. That on the one hand, it is completely correct that Putin has not attacked a NATO ally. The only attack that caused NATO to invoke Article 5 was on us, September 11th of 2001. Very different nature. So in some sense, the collective defense idea worked and still works. But on the other hand, because we've drawn a line around, okay, these are the protected territories, everything outside of that, Putin then looks at it and says, okay, that's fair game. I'm going to try to take these. And that is leading to war that is destabilizing in Europe now. What you begin to see is that our European allies are looking at this and saying, we have a problem now. We have a rogue actor in Putin that is threatening not just Ukraine, but will go beyond Ukraine if he has an opportunity. And therefore, the EU and Europe generally will not be safe and therefore not have the opportunity for prosperity until this is solved, until Ukraine is safe again too. So they're beginning to see that. And you may have seen speeches by French President Macron, which come as a surprise to anyone who has followed these issues for a long time. He is now 2.5 years after saying that NATO was brain dead. He's now advocating the most for NATO, even more so than the US and Germany are. And he's saying that this is the way in which Europe is going to become secure again. We have to band together in NATO. He obviously wants to have a career after his term as president is over, and he would like to see himself as the leader of the European Union at some point. So he wants to have a Europe to lead. But that is as raw as that may be of an interest, I think it's also real, is that he genuinely sees that Europe is now at a greater risk than it has been for a long time. So what should NATO be doing? I think NATO should be highlighting this war in Europe now and trying to identify ways to bring it to a close. Part of that is investment in our own defense capabilities so that we are producing more artillery, more drones, more things that the Ukrainians can use to recover their position and push Russia back out of their territory to the extent they can. I think we should be helping with protection of civilians. So, for example, as I mentioned, Russia bombs Ukraine every night, targeting civilians, targeting cities, targeting civilian infrastructure. I would think that just as we did with Israel recently, we can help the Ukrainians protect them. Shoot down the drones, shoot down the missiles and the rockets that are aimed there, at least in a section of Ukrainian territory that borders NATO, because it has already happened that Russia's attacks on Ukraine have created threats to NATO countries, some damage in NATO countries, at least one death in Poland. So there is a risk to NATO here, and it would make sense to shoot down and stop some of these missiles. Another thing that we do around the world, and we take very seriously, is freedom of navigation. We maintain freedom of navigation in the Taiwan Straits. We are doing that now off the Arabian Peninsula by not allowing the Houthis to attack international shipping on a major shipping route. We are not doing this in the Black Sea, which is a mystery to me. It is something that is a fundamental right. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were founded because we wanted to protect freedom of navigation, because our commercial ships were being attacked at the time off North Africa. This is a fundamental interest, and yet we allowed for over a year Russia to threaten third-party commercial shipping in the Black Sea if they went in and out of a Ukrainian port. Well, that's simply not acceptable. And it's not a threat to Russia for vessels carrying grain or sunflower oil to go in and out of the Black Sea. So I think this is something that NATO could be doing as well. We have the means to do it. It's a non-threatening activity, and it would be good both for the principle of freedom of navigation and also the practical issue of bringing food to the world, because Ukraine really is a breadbasket for the world. Now, I would argue also, I would take all of those things, I would argue also that in our aid to Ukraine, we should lift caveats on the equipment that we give and the use of that. We are just seeing in the past 2 weeks Russia firing what they're called glide bombs. They're dumb bombs that now have wings and GPS attached, and they attack Ukrainian cities. And they're firing these at the city of Kharkiv. It's their second largest city. And they're doing it from Russian territory and Russian airspace. And the U.S. is telling Ukraine, don't fire back. Don't take that out because that's in Russian territory. I think this is a huge mistake. Huge mistake, because it's flipping, international law on its head. Because international law says if you're attacked and there's an act of aggression, you have a right of self-defense. It's Article 51 of the UN Charter. And international law also says that there has to be proportionality. It's legitimate to strike military targets or militarily significant targets, but you don't attack civilians in cities and things like that. Russia is, of course, doing that to Ukraine, but it is perfectly legitimate for Ukraine to fire at an aircraft in Russian airspace that is firing missiles at Ukraine. So we're telling them not to do that. I think that's another thing NATO should take on, is to adopt a policy on supporting Ukraine's right to self-defense. And then finally, I think we need to start with all of these things thinking a little bit outside the box. I would like to see the U.S. ramp up oil and gas production to drive down prices and therefore make it harder for Putin to amass the war chest that he needs to pay for his war in Ukraine. When it's a high price of oil and gas, it just goes right into the military. We should be driving that price down. We could probably do that in partnership with Saudi Arabia if we were working with Saudi Arabia and Israel to build an alliance against Iran. So we ought to be thinking about some of these outside-the-box ways that we also address this. One of the things I learned, and I follow this stuff carefully, I only learned 2 weeks ago, the Treasury Department has an exemption of sanctions on Russian banks if the transactions are related to payment for energy. This to me is mind-boggling, because that's the main source of revenue for Putin's war budget. And we're exempting those payments because we're afraid of raising oil and gas prices if those transactions are not allowed to go through. That's not the way to keep the prices from rising. The way to keep them from rising is to put out more energy ourselves and encourage others to do that. And then I would argue that if we do all these things, we build up our own strength, we support and strengthen our allies, we give Ukraine the tools that it needs, we build more sound economics into our strategy as well. We can put in on the table a Lend-Lease proposal for Ukraine as well. We had it on the books for 2 years where they were authorized to borrow money from us for weapon systems. We did not approve it. So we gave them aid, but we didn't let them borrow money. If you remember or you know about World War II, what we did with the British was we let them borrow. And that's exactly what we should do for Ukraine as well. All of these things on the table would start to send a signal to Putin that you're not going to win here. You're going to keep breaking your pick on this effort to take over Ukraine. You're going to have to think about stopping, because it's going to just weaken Russia. That's the message that this NATO summit should convey to Putin. The current message that we are conveying to Putin is we're not doing these things, and we're also saying quite loudly that we're not going to be moving towards an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO. This, at least not until the war is over. So as long as the war is going on, you can't bring them into NATO. Well, this is a signal to Putin, therefore, keep the war going. Just keep fighting, keep Ukraine out, keep the West out, keep everyone divided. So this signal to Putin is the opposite right now of what it should be. The signal should be, we're a lot bigger than you, we're a lot stronger than you, you're never going to win, stop. And that's not where he is now. And then I would say that an invitation to Ukraine to begin talks about joining NATO should be issued at the Washington Summit. It's not going to happen right away. It took Poland 2 years from the time we started to the time they joined. It took the Swedes over a full year. All the other Central Europeans were over 2 years. But sending that signal of starting the process will also be a signal to Putin that this train is leaving the station. You're going to have to figure out how to end the war. That's where I think we need to go at the Washington Summit. Sadly, I don't think we will. I don't think the U.S. government and the German government are prepared to do any of these steps right now. But that doesn't mean that they're the wrong steps, and it doesn't mean we won't eventually get there. I think that when you start to see our European allies gel around this set of policies as they are doing, it will just be a matter of time before we figure out how to do this. And for those who worry that an invitation to Ukraine to join NATO is the U.S. taking on this defense commitment to Ukraine, true, but it's also a way to make sure it's not only the U.S. Because if you look at what's happening right now, we don't have any obligation to help Ukraine with its defense against Russian aggression, but we have an interest in doing so. And so we are providing over half of the military assistance that's going to Ukraine, and a little bit less than half of the economic assistance, more than maybe a third. If we bring them into NATO, there is now an obligation of everybody to take on the commitment to helping Ukraine defend itself and to protecting Ukraine. And as Hank here will tell you, every NATO common budget caps U.S. spending at NATO to about 20%, as opposed to putting U.S. spending as it is today on Ukraine at well over 50%. So it would be burden sharing to bring them into NATO. And it's also the only thing that is proven to Vladimir Putin to work, that NATO is strong enough that he doesn't attack. When you're not in NATO, like Georgia or Ukraine, then he does attack. So it's a way, it's part of what we should be building into our strategy of convincing Putin we have to end the war. And that's where I think we want to get back to. If we don't start ending these wars will keep expanding. And that's my main point and my main concern. I think that kind of captures the NATO summit. Obviously, this is taking place against the backdrop of U.S. politics and U.S. elections. And I think that's an entirely unpredictable thing. And in some ways, it's maybe not, I know it affects everybody's psychology. I travel to Europe a lot. Everyone is really worried about Donald Trump. Will he become president? If so, what's he going to do? But I think that we need to actually focus on the substance and not the personalities. That what I just outlined was what I believe the right set of policies would be that would reestablish a position of strength and prevent war. And I think that if Biden did these things, we should applaud. And if he doesn't, and Donald Trump gets elected and he does these things, we should applaud. And I think that's the way I would look at how to sort through the politics. Don't focus on this guy, that guy, but focus on what's really our interest here. So with that, I think I covered what Larry asked me to cover. And I'm going to pause there and open it up for questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and address anything. Sir.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that our enemies see us mistake chaos for weakness. Could you tell me the difference between chaos and weakness?
Yeah. Well, what I was trying to draw is a comparison to Reagan's comment of peace through strength. And what we have now is chaos in the world because of perceptions of weakness, of perceptions of our weakness. So that is causing the fact that they perceive us as lacking resolve, lacking moral clarity, lacking willingness to commit resources. They see that as weakness, and so they act. And Putin goes and attacks Ukraine. Hamas goes and attacks Israel with Iranian support and direction. The Houthis attack shipping. China starts rattling the sabers about Taiwan and so on because they see that weakness.
When you ask a question, I'm going to call on people because we've had a request for me to repeat the question so to make sure everybody hears and for recording purposes. Let me go over here and then I'll come over here.
Yeah. Would you please comment on the extent to which our current national debt of some $30 trillion and our ongoing deficits of $1 trillion every few months would interfere with and maybe perhaps even prevent our ability to build and maintain sufficient military strength to persuade these other people that it's not a healthy thing to come in?
Yeah.
So the question was, will our very, very large debts going forward undermine our ability to deter by undermining our strength at home?
And I guess my answer to that is, in some ways it already does. And so it is already having that negative impact that you raise, both by inhibiting us in our decision making. We are so tied up with commitments to spending that we don't have the freedom to think about what we could actually do or should actually do because we are overcommitted. So that's one impact. And then the other is seeing that others in the world, China in particular, which sits on a lot of cash, can take advantage of that situation. And just the example that I gave earlier about Africa, China goes into Africa, says, we want to build a road, we'll lend you the money so that we'll build the road for you, and you'll owe us the money later. And by the way, we want these minerals, we want this mine, we want this, and we won't say a word to you about human rights. So China is taking advantage of that position already. I do think it is critically important that we try to get our arms around this. At the same time, we have a tremendous benefit that we have the healthiest economy in the world, and we have everybody willing to use the U.S. dollar so that we are able to float this large debt and still be in a very strong position and still be a global leader. So it's not having an immediate destructive impact, but it's having a noticeable smaller impact, but the potential for it to be really bad if we don't get our arms around it.
You said that there's a perception of weakness, that our country is weakening or whatever. I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that, because I certainly don't feel that way. We're looked up to by many countries. So please explain,
Sure.
And what is the solution?
Yeah. Let me give you some examples as to why some countries would conclude that. One of them is the time it took for us to do what is in our own interest in giving aid to Ukraine, military assistance to Ukraine. It took 6 months. We all knew what the parameters were, but that is perceived, the delay, even though there's good reasons for it, and sound, democratic political reasons why you got to have public support and you got to have the political support to take a step. But from abroad, that's seen as they're not serious, they're not ready, they're not in this. You have the political polarization in many countries in the West, not just the U.S., but look at France, look at Germany, look at Italy, look at the UK. This is seen by dictators who don't have political opposition as weakness as well. They have to fight with each other. They can't make decisions. The government may fall. So that's a perception of weakness. We just talked about the willingness to spend money because we don't have as much of it to spend. We have a lot of money, but not cash that's available to spend. So they view that as Putin can pour 40% of his state budget into this war in Ukraine and just tell the Russian people, suck it up. We can't do that. And we shouldn't do that. But that, in his eyes, is, I'm stronger than these guys. I can outlast these guys. I can wear them down. So a lot of these things add up to a sense of the West is lacking resolve, lacking commitment, lacking resources or willingness to commit resources. And so those are just the ones right on the surface. You can go in each case. I mean, Iran, we have bent over backwards to try to negotiate deals with Iran, to get them not to develop their nuclear weapon, to return sanctioned assets, billions of dollars worth. And the Iranians know what they're doing. They're not changing their desire to build a nuclear bomb. They're not changing their desire to wipe Israel off the map. They're just playing us. They're just playing us to negotiate a deal with them to get what they want. So I think they view that as weakness as well. And you can play that through all of these different examples that I raised of places around the world. How do you fix it? How do you fix it? I think what I would do is start, as I said earlier, and say, what should the U.S. strategy be? Invest in ourselves, first and foremost. Invest in strengthening the economy, increasing our own energy independence and exports of oil and gas, having more of an impact on global prices, investing in our defense capabilities so everybody knows that we have these capabilities, there is nothing to threaten there, and then do everything we can to work with and support our allies so that we are building alliances around the world, both with peoples and with states that are aligned with us, that share our values, because that's the force multiplier that we have that others don't.
I may repeat it, though. I need it for...
For almost 2.5 years it's the Ukrainian-Russian war. I've kept up with it. The losses that Russia has incurred, I don't know what the numbers are, 100,000, whatever it is. Morale is bad. People have left the country. They don't want to serve. How much damage has been done to the Russian army that might preclude them from, as you say, going into the bordering countries?
Yeah.
The question, essence of the question is how much has the casualties that Russian army has suffered, and they've been great. I think maybe it's more 300,000.
Yeah,
have I heard
closer
that?
to 300,000.
Rather than just the 100,000. How much could that affect their ability to go in and try to do to other nations what they're doing to Ukraine right now?
Yeah. So in the short term, a significant impact. In the short term, they are focused on the war effort in Ukraine. They are 140 million population. Ukraine's less than 40 million now. They have a lot more reserves of people that they can throw at this, and they are throwing them at this. And one Russian exile, former government official who's now living in Latvia, told me that it's actually having a perverse effect in the countryside, in the hinterland in Russia, the regions, because they pay for the loss of a life. They'll give the families money. There's actually been a little bit of a boom to the regional economies because they're getting paid from Moscow. So it's stabilizing the society a little bit, even though they're losing people. Equipment, they've lost... estimates are at least a third of their conventional military equipment, maybe more. And that third is the third that works. So they're taking stuff out of storage that has been cannibalized, that is 60 years old, that is questionable in its effectiveness. They're taking out artillery systems that don't use the same ammunition that they make anymore. So they don't have the ammunition for the system that they had. So a whole lot of damage there. And that's a good thing because that gives Ukraine a chance. Ukraine has friends, Ukraine has allies, Ukraine is building up its military capabilities, and Russia is, in fact, damaging itself. But it all depends on what happens. If Ukraine loses, or even if Russia just is allowed to take some of the territory, stabilize, sanctions are lifted, they rebuild, they will be in a position to attack others conventionally. Right now, they're choosing not to do that because it would be stretching them too far. But give them 5 years of stabilizing this war, and then they could do it again. And what they are doing, since they don't have the conventional forces, but they still view themselves at war with the West, they're doing all sorts of other hybrid attacks. So things that are intended to create instability in societies. I was in Lithuania 6 weeks ago, eight weeks ago. They have paid protesters claiming to support the Polish minorities that are allegedly discriminated against in Lithuania, and they're not. But they are Russian-speaking, and they're paid by the Russians to go out and protest on that, to stir up divisions in society. They have people going around taking down Lithuanian flags from public buildings, just paid to go create that disruption, throwing paint, red paint, onto Lithuanian national symbols and statues in order to denigrate those. They beat up a member of the Russian opposition who used to work with Navalny, Leonid Volkov. They went to his house and beat him up with meat hammers. So they're doing, and that they didn't try to kill him. They're just trying to intimidate him, but they're also trying to intimidate Lithuania. Say, you don't want these people in your country. So that's just in Lithuania. You remember the Skripal thing in the UK where they track down and murder people. They've done that in Germany as well. They've done it in the United States. So this is a lot, and we haven't even talked about cyber attacks and infrastructure attacks, which they do. There's a lot that the Russians are doing that is non-conventional already in order to create some effects of being in conflict with the West. And given the opportunity to rebuild, they would certainly seek to do so. You may have seen also they recently replaced the Minister of Defense and put in place an economist with no military experience because they realize now that their economic side of the war is not in good shape. So they put somebody in who they hope will be able to build up that economic side of the war to give them more resilience. So it's both and. It is a bad situation for the Russian forces. We have to hope that it gets so bad that it creates a reaction inside Russia to stop the war. But thus far, I think Putin he's made his commitment that he wants to fight as far as he can.
I got a question over here and then over there, and we'll try to get to everyone.
First, a quick comment. The Russians have probably lost more than 300,000, but if they're reaching NIE and DIA is also, and Avril Haines just came out with an assessment that they were pretty shocked at how quickly the Russian defense industry is reconstructing itself, much quicker than we realized. And that's mostly because of the help from China with technology and outside sources like Iran and North Korea, as you pointed out. So they are coming back. 5 years, I think, now is much too long to wait for their military capability to come back. Whatever is going to happen in Ukraine, it's got to happen positively for us within the next year to year and a half, in my humble opinion. It remains to be seen how that will go. I will tell you, in my opinion, the Russian army is terrible. They should have been able to beat the crap out of the Ukrainians from jumpstart. They certainly should have been able to do it now when they have an advantage of 10 artillery shells to 1. They can't do it because they are an incompetent force. We've got to take advantage of that now, and we've got to get the arms and munitions to the Ukrainians that have been held up horribly for these last 6 to 7 months. That's just a paid political announcement, but from an old I'm an old Soviet hand here, so I'm here to tell you that's my personal opinion, but I know the Russians pretty well. Question I have for you. There's 300, and this is something I don't understand. I really don't know the answer to. There's some $300 billion in frozen Russian assets in Western banks. Why can't we use some or all of that to help fund this rearming of Ukraine? There must be some sort of cogent political or economic reason. I don't understand that.
Yeah. So before we get to the assets, just to comment on the defense industry. I saw what Avril Haines said in her testimony. I've also spoken to former Minister of Economy of Russia, who's now in exile in Lithuania, former Prime Minister who's now in exile in Latvia, and they don't believe it. They think this is a lot of just a lot of puffing up by Russia to get inside our heads. They don't believe it's really going that well. But either way, your bottom line is I completely agree with. We should take advantage of this situation to make sure that the war ends favorably from our perspective as soon as possible. That should be the goal. Now, on the Russian assets, I don't think there's a good reason why we do not take the Russian assets that are sitting in Western facilities, most of them in Belgium, and put them into a fund for Ukraine. You have to have some governance over what is that used for. Is it used for weapons, or is it used for reconstruction? Is it used for reparations later on? Okay, decisions to make. But that money should be seized and put towards Ukraine. And there are sound legal reasons for this. We have the precedent of what we did with Iraqi assets after the Gulf War. We have the crime of aggression against a sovereign state, which Russia has committed. It's not something everyone in the world is doing. We have the war crimes on an individual level against civilians, against torture of soldiers, Geneva Conventions, everything. So there's a lot of reasons why we can say this is a unique circumstance and there's a legal basis for it, so we're going to do this. But you do not have a willingness to do that from Germany, from the U.S. Treasury Department, and from Belgium. And Belgium being the host of the EU and the host of Euroclear, which is where most of the money is now sitting because it's the clearance bank. They make the argument that we don't want to diminish the credibility of our economies and our banks as a safe place for sovereigns to put money. We don't want sovereigns that have lots of funds to put somewhere to go elsewhere, like to China, Asia Development Bank, or something else. We want it to stay here. We don't want them to have a run on the banks where sovereigns, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden take their money out. That would be a problem as well. I think these fears are grossly exaggerated, and I think it would be very easy to make a case that this is a singular thing that others would buy into. So I don't really think that those arguments make very much sense, but they are the reason that we're not doing it. And I would add particularly about Belgium, because they're a small country within the EU, they want some kind of cover. They want the G7 to make this decision, and they want the EU to make this decision. But the G7, to include the US and Germany, doesn't want to do it. So Belgium can very happily then sit on the reserves. The reserves earn interest. They tax the interest. The interest tax goes to the Belgian budget. So they're just sitting there for now. They recently promised to stop taking the tax money and giving that tax money to Ukraine. That's basically smoke and mirrors right now, because they have been giving aid to Ukraine already. Now they're going to say that, well, that aid we're giving to Ukraine is coming from this, and it's not going to be a net difference.
I have a question back here, Kurt.
There you go.
To what extent has the West's fear of Russia using nuclear weapons, tactical or otherwise, impacted their desire to take the actions that you espouse?
Yes, absolutely. The question is, how much has the threat of nuclear use impacted our decision-making? And I would say enormously and excessively. You should never disregard the risk that nuclear weapons present. But you also need to remember that deterrence works for a reason, that if you cross that threshold, the consequences are too big for everybody. And we instead of reinforcing deterrence, we've been deterred. We are choosing not to take steps that would make sense in order to avoid facing a nuclear scenario. And Putin is very clever at constantly raising the threat of, oh, we might use tactical nuclear weapons, we might have to do this to protect ourselves, in order to cause us to avoid steps that we would otherwise think are reasonable to take. So we need to think this through on our own a little bit. Never disregard the threat, but like strategic nuclear weapons, not a chance, because it would be catastrophic for Russia, and they know that. Tactical nuclear weapons, okay, what would they achieve on a battlefield? How would that actually work? Typically, Russian doctrine is that you would use nuclear weapons against your adversary if they are attacking your country and you are losing. That's their doctrine. To use them offensively in trying to take and hold territory in another country doesn't really make very much sense, because where you're using them is briefly uninhabitable and it's destroying the territory that you're hoping to take. What is the value to that? It would not be, we were hearing the comment earlier about the quality of the Russian military. The Russian military does not believe that they would be safe if nuclear weapons were used. They would not be safe from their own nuclear weapons. And so they're not very confident in this. And we don't have to threaten nuclear use to threaten conventional use against any use of nuclear weapons, because we don't want to live in a world where the use of nuclear weapons is normalized. So that is something we have already done. We have warned the Russians, don't do it, or there will be consequences. And China and India have also warned Russia, don't use nuclear weapons. So I think we are in a much stronger position to deter Russia on nuclear use, and therefore should not be deterred ourselves simply because Putin keeps bringing them up.
I got a question over here. Kurt.
So how do you think the Chips and Inflation Reduction Act how do you think the Chips and Inflation Reduction Act will provide their advertised benefits, and when should we expect to see the payoff, and what unanticipated consequences, good or bad, do you think may occur as a result of onshoring processes that have historically been global collective efforts?
Yeah. So just by the way the global economy worked, you had a concentration of microchip production largely in Taiwan, which was not to our advantage, because if they're at risk by mainland China, that could seriously disrupt supply at some point. So bringing chip production onshore, I think, is a fundamental security improvement for the U.S., for U.S. industry. That's the first part. Second part is the Inflation Reduction Act. That is the most misnamed bill I think I have ever heard. Not least of all because it didn't reduce inflation. But that is about picking and choosing winners in industry, and particularly those focused on green technology. That's a choice. Governments get to make these choices. Do they want to do that or not do that? Typically, I think you're better off creating the conditions, tax conditions, for businesses to then see what's competitively viable. Maybe investment in basic science and research and feeding that in industry to see what's competitively viable, rather than picking industry winners. So I'm a little skeptical that the IRA is going to produce the long-term positive results, but I'm very upbeat about the CHIPS Act and the kind of results that's going to produce both on industry and on our security.
One more question on this side.
I wanted to first start off by thanking you again for being here. My question, though, is pertaining to as the United States election, becomes or is in full throttle, and as you state, we are at a consequential point in our history, pertaining for foreign affairs. What president, after first term of each, President Biden and President Trump, which one better serves our nation's interests? And if I may elaborate on that, particularly with Trump doing a well enough job in the Middle East, as Hamas didn't attack during that time, while they have attacked under President Biden's term and before that under Trump's predecessor, President Obama, and then likewise, the relative disablement of the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. You can choose your own. I will tell you that either president has every opportunity before them, if they get elected, to make the right choices to rebuild our strength as a country and to promote strength and security for our allies and rebuild peace in the world. They both have the opportunity. The same policy decisions could take us the same direction. So it's really a matter of thinking about the policies and making your own judgment. Who do you think is more likely to do that? But either one has equal opportunity, and we'll know 5 years from now what actually happened.
Okay, I have a question. Where was it? There was one? Yeah, right there. Excuse me. Sorry. And then we'll come back over here. Excuse me. Sorry.
Thank you. Getting 32 people to agree on things is hard enough. Getting 32 countries to do so is very difficult. What would you say are the top 3 issues that internally could cause problem for NATO to continue to be successful?
Well, I think the number one issue we have today is, let me start that over. I want to address your point about 32. It's true that getting 32 people or 32 countries to agree on something requires some effort. But at the same time, these are 32, for the most part, like-minded countries who share common interests and common strategic security interests. And that has tended to work at NATO pretty well. And I've been around that table when you have conversations. There's a lot of shared commitment and shared desire to make sure that we are working together as an alliance. If you remember in the early days of the Iraq War, a lot of controversy within NATO. A lot of NATO allies did not want the U.S. to go into Iraq. Turkey did not want the U.S. to go into Iraq. And we did anyway. So it was really divisive within NATO. And then Turkey turns around and says, we are now at risk of Iraq hitting back against us because we're right here as a neighbor. So we want you, NATO countries, Netherlands, Germany, send Patriot missiles to Turkey to help protect us in case there's that kind of retaliation. So everyone was upset with Turkey briefly, saying, how dare they? We asked for their help. They told us no. Now we have a very divided alliance. Saddam Hussein's going to fight back, and now they want us to protect them. And after that first 2 or 3 days of getting everyone's emotions out, then we realized that, of course, that's what NATO is for, is that even if we don't like the way we got here, we actually have to help Turkey be protected. Because another day, it might be somebody else. It might be the Baltic states, it might be Germany, it might be the U.S., or Italy, and we don't want anyone to say no then. So we better say yes to Turkey now and do this because that's what makes NATO work. So it's actually a lot easier to pull people together generally when they're like-minded and share common interests than it might seem just by the number 32. Now, the biggest problem we have is we have one country, which is Hungary, and I feel very sad about Hungary because I lived there. I know them very, very well, speak Hungarian. But they have chosen to take a position that is, I would describe it as treat Ukraine as a buffer zone. Let the Russians attack, let the war play out, don't get us involved, don't do anything with Ukraine. And cut deals with Russia for continued access to cheap Russian gas and Russian finance as well. So completely at odds with where the rest of the alliance is. There's even an expression for this in Hungarian, which is the little gate. So the idea is when you have a castle and somebody comes up to the castle, they go to the main drawbridge and they knock on the door with the big knockers and all that. And this is the big gate. But the Hungarians always, merchants, traders, always trying to hustle somebody, go in the little gate. And that's exactly the mentality of what they're doing with Russia right now, and a little bit with China and Europe as well. That's a problem. That's not going to change anytime soon. We're going to have an issue of managing Hungary. The advantage we have in dealing with that problem is that they are in the European Union and they need money from the European Union. So while we can't persuade them at NATO, the withholding of support from the European Union usually brings them around. And so we're able to manage that. The other issue we have at NATO right now, and this is the one that I think is temporary, but we have the US and Germany on one side, and then everybody else, leaving Hungary out of this for the moment, everybody else on the other side. And this is the US-German fear of escalation versus the fear of Russia from everybody else. And we have, and I've heard people in the administration phrase it this way, we must preserve NATO unity, meaning all of you other people, all you 30 other countries, you have to agree with us. And that doesn't go over very well. I've been traveling a lot in Europe this year, a lot of grumbling and resentment over that. But that will not last. That's going to be this year. I'd say no matter who wins presidency next year, that's going to change. We're going to be looking for unifying the alliance in reality by listening a little bit more, putting a little bit more effort into it.
Okay. Over here, Kurt.
Thank you, Ambassador, for a great talk. One of the things that concerns me is that you talked earlier about hybrid attacks and about, of course, the concept of chaos and weakness and how that's kind of infiltrating a lot of our societies and certainly the member states in NATO. What, if anything, is NATO doing to address hybrid attacks? Now, Article 5, of course, is for hot wars, or at least I believe it's intended for a hot war. But nonetheless, it seems to me like we are at war.
Yeah.
But we're at war in cyber, we're at war in disinformation, we're at war in hybrid attacks. Is there anything NATO's considering regarding hybrid attacks?
This is a great question. First off, there is a NATO Center of Excellence. This is what NATO has done, is they've created these various centers of excellence in different areas. And there is one on hybrid warfare. So NATO has actually created a place, each country has dedicated personnel to this, to study what is it that's actually happening. So realization is the first step. And the way I would frame it is Putin is at war with us using hybrid attacks. We do not perceive ourselves to be at war with Russia. So it's a disconnect where he's constantly doing this, and we just think that this is a nuisance and we don't know, what we should do about it. There is a mechanism at NATO. We always talk about Article 5, which is the collective defense commitment. And as you rightly say, it is aimed at a physical attack on the territory of a NATO country. But there is Article 4, which is any NATO member can call for consultations in the alliance if they perceive a threat to their security. And we have not had Article 4 consultations at NATO about Russian hybrid attacks against alliance members. And I don't know why. I can guess why. It's because we think that would be provocative to hold a meeting to talk about Russian attacks against us. I think that's crazy. Honestly, I think we should be doing it tomorrow. We should immediately call such a meeting, or the Estonians should do it, or the Poles should do it, because we actually have to start the conversation about what constitutes an attack and how should we respond to those things? Can they be deterred? What would be the means of deterrence, the threat of retaliation? So we haven't done any of that. And I think we're just in a state of wishful thinking at the moment.
Kurt, would you say that it would be actually maybe even more useful as a signal to Russia if another country, not us, made the request, we would back it up?
Yes, yeah, that would, and it would be more real, because in a place like Lithuania or a place like Poland, it's very tangible every day. And I'm sure the reason they're not doing it is because we've told them we don't want them to do it. We should flip that around and say we ought to actually call this, and we'll back it up and start this discussion. And just the discussion itself would be a signal to Putin that his era of free riding on NATO's unwillingness to act may be coming to a close.
I have a question over here, and then we'll take one more.
Bottom line in any war boils down to boots on the ground. And the Ukrainian forces are terribly undermanned. Now, you made the case that Russia is an existential threat to world peace. And my question to you, should NATO face up to this real threat and move troops in, or at the very least, sanction international brigades? They need more soldiers.
Yeah, that's a great question, too. Several thoughts on that. Bottom line up front, yes. I think we have articulated a view that, we should never put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Whether or not we do that, we should never say we won't do it. We should say everything is on the table. We'll evaluate as we go. We will not let Ukraine fail. We have to be sending the signal to Putin that we have more resources by a long shot than he has. We have 22 times the size of the Russian economy. Russia's economy is about the size of Texas. We can outlast him. We can outman them. We can do everything. So that's the thing. We should not take things off the table. Second, Ukrainian manpower shortage is not as bad as it seems. There's a lot of reporting about it, but they only would conscript people into the military beginning at age 27. We do 18, right? So there's a whole lot of people who are not covered under conscription at this point. They recently passed a law to drop it to 25. That law is now in effect, and they are going to be replenishing. And in talking with Ukrainians, a friend of mine just recently in Copenhagen, he made the point that the equipment and ammunition shortage is the biggest deterrent to recruitment. That you don't want to get recruited and then not have any weapons and any ammunition. So fixing that problem, where there is enough ammunition, enough equipment, will fix the recruitment problem as well. So that was his view. That was the second point. Third point is Macron, the president of France, who I mentioned earlier, very explicitly put on the table, we should consider helping Ukraine with its air defense, which I think is a very legitimate suggestion. You could put NATO air defense batteries in Poland and Romania and look over your Ukrainian territory, or you could put them inside Ukraine. What difference does it make? And he particularly mentioned Odessa and southwestern Ukraine, because that is the economic lifeline for Ukraine. That's where the grain goes, that's where the sunflower oil goes, that's the shipping. And if that is secure, it actually creates the ability to help Ukraine start growing its economy again. They grew about 6% last year after a 30% drop the previous year. It needs to be growing back faster. And so helping them with air defense would allow some of that investment and some of that development to take place. And you could do that by having forces in Ukrainian territory that are protecting the airspace, protecting civilians and cities, freeing up the Ukrainian military forces to then fight further east.
Thank you.
Let's do two more.
The question I have is, do you think that our existing institutions are up to the challenges of today? And I'm specifically thinking about the United Nations. You've got Russia that sits on the Security Council, which is, it seems like an oxymoron, but they occupy the largest landmass of any country on the planet. They have over 11 time zones, and yet they're up to taking over more territory. And it just doesn't seem like our United Nations is up to the task, and some of the other institutions, not NATO, but
Yeah.
and the second part of my question also is, what do you think is motivating Putin? Is it his legacy and restoring the Soviet Union, or do you think it's economic for the Soviet Union? It's certainly not, I don't know, his care for the people of the Ukraine, because he's just devastated the country.
Yeah. So on to Putin's motivation first, and then back to institutions. He has said it very clearly. He compares himself to Peter the Great and to Catherine the Great. He wants to build the Russian Empire. He wants to go down in history as one of the builders of the Russian Empire, not one of the leaders who lost territory like Lenin. So he doesn't value the Soviet Union. It's Russian greatness that he wants to restore. And he believes that Russia has and is entitled to that, as a God-given right to these territories and to rule over these other peoples. And he believes in the idea of empire. Empire is, Russia is the leader. Yes, we have other ethnic groups and other people that live inside our country, but they are all Russian. And on the idea of Ukraine, he believes they are confused Russians who have been brainwashed by the West. No, he literally believes that he believes, if you saw his Tucker Carlson interview, he says that Russia was founded in Kyiv in the 800s. This is nuts. This is the opposite.
It's a great luxury to be able to write your own history.
Yeah, this is the opposite. I mean, if anything, you would have to say that Russia was originally a colony of Ukraine that then grew bigger, much like we were a colony of Great Britain. That's a more apt parallel. But that is, Putin has a very different ideology behind what he's doing. On the institutions, I don't think the UN Security Council provides any value at all as long as you have Putin and Xi and those types of regimes on the Security Council. When it was founded, we had a very different view about what this would be. It is completely broken now. There are other parts of the UN that still work. A lot of the international organizations under the UN system are still valuable and worth having around. We get a lot of criticism of UNRWA these days because of Hamas. But leaving that aside, you have refugees, you have the ILO, you have the International Telecommunications Union, you have the World Trade Organization, you have the World Health Organization. These all provide a tremendous amount of value. Maybe it's not as efficient as it should be, but these still work. So I wouldn't want to throw out the whole UN system. The General Assembly still has some sense of legitimacy as well, and has actually voted against Russia several times over its war in Ukraine. But we can't have any hope for the Security Council at the moment, and probably for a long time. We started off the talk here reminding about 1938. That was also that general time period. I don't want to give a year, but that general time period is when the League of Nations fell apart as well. Similar reasons.
Okay, Ambassador Volker has agreed to one more question. So sorry for the rest of it.
Thank you. In spite of the war right at Europe's doorstep, we're having problems in NATO having the countries spend even 2% of their GNP, as they've committed to do for many years. And personally, I don't want to send my son and daughters, nieces and nephews to fight for people who didn't even want to spend 2% to prepare. So what can we do, if anything, to make sure that Europe is prepared so we don't have to go over?
Yeah. every country is a sovereign country, so it's very hard to force them to do something. But that being said, the situation has changed a lot since, take 2017 when President Trump was elected the first time. You had 3 countries in NATO spending 2% of GDP on defense. Today it's 23. And some of them, like Poland, are spending 4% of GDP on defense. All the Baltic states are well north of 2%. And the trend line is for a few more countries to get there this year, so it'll probably be up to 25 or so. But you have France, you have Italy, you have Canada, Netherlands, all below where they need to be. We need to constantly name and shame and push them on exactly the point that you made. It is not politically sustainable for us to be responsible for your defense if you're not responsible for your defense. It's just not politically sellable. And we just have to keep after that and keep after that and keep after that. 2 of the things that have recently been proposed, and I'm in favor of both of them, the Secretary General has suggested these. One of them is to create a NATO fund for Ukraine so that everybody is contributing 0.25% of GDP. They spend 2.25 on defense and give 0.25% to this NATO fund so that Ukraine has a steady stream of funding for their military for the long haul. And the U.S. share of that, if we go by the NATO formulas, we would do half that, 0.125, which would be 20% of the total fund. That's the right way to do this, to get our responsibility back in proportion to where it should be. That, I think, is a very good idea. Second thing that people have talked about is not only raising the goal to 2.25, but raising it to 3%, because we face serious threats in Europe. We also face serious threats in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa. And the U.S. should be able to look around globally. And so we really need our European allies to be leading in Europe, and setting a higher goal and trying to hold them to that would allow us to free up more of our resources for other responsibilities.
Before we thank Ambassador Volker, I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions. There isn't enough time. But I was telling Ambassador Volker as we were, this is his first time in Savannah, so we were going around Savannah, seeing some of the sites. And I said, without an exception, when all of the speakers have come here, they have all remarked to me or to other of the board members, those are the best questions we ever got in any of our, because you've had people here that do a lot of public speaking, and they are always very impressed, I would guess.
Yes,
Ambassador Volker
indeed.
would feel, I put him on the spot on that one. You can't say no. But I really want to, we really do appreciate how thoughtful your questions are, and I know that all the speakers do. I wanted to mention something. If you're more interested in this, obviously you can follow Ambassador Volker and watch some of his, YouTube or other recordings of his speeches and follow him otherwise. There's also, and he and I were talking about this too today, there's a new book out. I'm not hawking the book. I have no financial involvement in this, but David Sanger of the New York Times has just come out with a book that will be familiar given what Ambassador Volker said. It's called New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. I haven't read it yet. I've listened to a few interviews with Mr. Sanger, whom both of us know. And it's an interesting. You'll agree, you'll disagree, but you might find it interesting if you want to read more. It's about how much more, and Ambassador Volker alluded to this, how much more multifaceted the challenge, and therefore more dangerous, the challenges are to the United States, because they're coming from multiple sources, working together, as Ambassador Volker said. One quick question by a show of hands. Who of you have lived overseas, worked overseas, had other international experience? That's what I thought. That's what we thought. At some point, I'm going to plant the idea, at some point, we thought of turning the tables on all of you. And when we're in during an academic session, during the academic year, having students who are interested in international affairs come in and maybe you be the speakers. all of you collectively, and maybe offer your thoughts on your experiences overseas, because one thing we try to do when we talk to student groups, and we try to get our speakers out to both high schools and universities, we don't say, you should do this for your career, do that. But it would be great, we think personally, if you had an international component to what you do with your life. So maybe, if there is interest, maybe we can turn the tables and you all can offer your views and advice. And lastly, let me just say to everyone, have a good summer over the next few months. As the song goes, we'll see you in September for our next speaker. And a big round of applause for Ambassador Volker. Thank you.